I'm Janice.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. Today we're going to be talking about the nature of reality. Having come here by way of our own unique paths, both of us have independently arrived at the idea that, even in light of all the unusual flavors of this time, the current moment is characterized most especially by the potential it holds for expanding human consciousness. And this has everything to do with our topic for today, the nature of reality. Why? Well, because it turns out that there are huge overlapping areas in seemingly disparate phenomena. And that's what we're going to unpack, at least to some degree, today. But in order to have any conversation in this terrain, it's important to at least consider our existing assumptions alongside what science, ancient texts, and the human experience suggests is true about the nature of reality. So today's conversation will be broken up into 4 basic buckets. Basic theories about the nature of reality, assuming the one that the vast majority of humanity assumes is true. The reason why that assumption may be erroneous, and what science, ancient texts from diverse times and cultures, and human experience says may be closer to the truth. What all of this has to do with human consciousness, and most especially, what that means for our individual and collective lives. So I'm going to punt it to you here, Darren, to get us started. Tell us a little bit about what reality is and what are the possible theories.
Thank you. And I would say, first of all, we might want to ask ourselves, what do we mean by quote-unquote reality? And why would we even question its nature? So many people walking along the street that you pass in your everyday world might not be entertaining these kinds of questions. They might actually be working under the consensus narrative, which is that we have reality pretty much figured out, and we're just now crossing T's and dotting I's at this point. We know that we live in an era where so-called physicalism has been dominant, although we will point out, based on our understanding, because we follow these trends, that we actually are seeing tracking away from that, actually, and something like idealism is gaining steam. We will talk today about many of the reasons why that is the case, and it's basically all to do with empirical data that we are seeing that just does not play well with the notions of physicalism. Now, there are several different main conceptions of reality that currently exist in Western civilization, and we will go through each of them, and then we will later on get into our personal opinions about which one hold the most steam and why, and we'll also get into some of the empirical data. So the first one is what I just mentioned, physicalism. It's also sometimes referred to as materialism, although physicalism is the more commonly used reference now. This view holds that the universe is entirely composed of matter and energy, and that all phenomena, including consciousness, can be explained through physical processes. Materialism asserts that there is no supernatural or spiritual realm, and that reality is fundamentally physical. So again, this is the dominant paradigm in the West, and to some degree, because the West has been expanding across the world, it's the dominant paradigm over much of the world. Next, we have what I mentioned, which is idealism, which it's been around for a long time. It kind of was the dominant paradigm for a long time, even within Western civilization. It's only over the last few centuries that we've moved away from it. And people like Bernardo Kastrup, which I've mentioned on many of my other podcasts, is pointing out that really this is the anomaly to be working under the physicalist paradigm, and that it doesn't hold water very well. And that's why we're quickly moving back towards idealism, which is in the big picture of things, something that's been dominant for most of our civilization's history, actually. It's really the blink of an eye in terms of human civilization scale that we've been working under the tenets of physicalism. So what does idealism say? In contrast to materialism, idealism suggests that reality is fundamentally mental or spiritual, or you might say energetic, and that the physical world is either an illusion or a manifestation of consciousness. This perspective holds that the mind or consciousness is the primary basis of reality. This resonates with the role of the observer in quantum mechanics, and we'll get into today some of the empirical data coming out of quantum mechanics. Now, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is one of the most widely accepted interpretations, also suggests that reality is not fully determined until it is observed, and that the act of measurement plays a crucial role in shaping reality. You probably need to listen to that again if you're unfamiliar with these notions, because it sounds incredibly strange, sounds very counterintuitive, and this is indeed why there are multiple interpretations of quantum mechanics, because the revelations were so revolutionary that many people have really wrestled with trying to make sense of this. What does this say of the ultimate nature of reality? And then we have a notion like dualism. Now, dualistic theories propose that reality consists of two distinct substances, matter and mind, or you might say body and soul. This view holds that the mental and physical realms are separate but interacting, and that consciousness cannot be reduced to purely physical processes. So you have physicalism or materialism that says it's all basically physical, and anything even like consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of those physical structures, basically. And without the physical structures, there is nothing. Idealism says the exact opposite, that it's actually the mental or spiritual underpinning which gives birth to anything we would consider physical. Then you have dualism, which kind of says both exist in parallel kind of thing. And when we think about monotheistic traditions and talking about us living our lives here, and when we die, we go to some other place, some ethereal place, that's kind of working under a dualistic principle as well. I do want to bring one more into the mix, which is panpsychism, because this has become more popular recently. Panpsychism posits that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe. According to this view, all matter has a form of consciousness or subjective experience, not just humans or animals. This implies that even the smallest particles, like atoms or subatomic particles, possess some form of awareness or experiential properties. Now, I would just want to point out here that really I think this is cheating a little bit. It's saying we want to stick with materialism, we want to stick with physicalism, but because there's these issues like the hard problem of consciousness, which we'll get into later today, because that exists and it's been so dominant for decades now, basically, panpsychism tries to deal with this by saying, well, everything's ultimately material, but even things like atoms and the smallest particles of nature have some degree of consciousness. And then somehow it sort of posits that magically these come together in a body like ours and harmonize into some sense of self. But that is really questionable, you could argue. I think idealism is the best fit out of these ones we've talked about, both because of my personal experience and based on the empirical data. But I'd love to hear your take on what you think about that, Janice, and what your process has been to get there.
Thank you, Darren. Oh my gosh, yeah, a long process. I arrived, just to make things quick and easy, I arrived at exactly the same place as you. Nothing else makes sense to me than idealism, and we'll talk a little bit more about why. I do want to just point out a couple of things that as we're all percolating on this. One is that neither Darren nor I are obviously physicists, so there's a limit to what we can explain or even understand. But in a way, this is kind of perfect, I think, because there are just very few people in the world who are physicists. And it is pretty clear, I think, both of us, that this language is going to have to become more common because it's truer, probably, than anything else. But I do want to say to anybody who's listening, if there are concepts that are murky or questions that you have after this, please do send them our way, because I think this is the beginning of a much longer conversation, precisely because it is so intrinsically related to everything. So I love that you pointed out that the idealist assumptions of the nature of reality they're sort of more normative than a lot of the materialist assumptions that we think of as normal and natural and forever, having been forever true. That's actually not very true. The idealist assumptions have been visible for a long time, but I think the implications are so incredible and so at odds with the prevailing paradigm of materialism that they barely even make it into textbooks, like even at the college level. I've been kind of blown away by that. But I suspect that part of it is, as I said, the implications about what it means. Because if you take idealism to its logical conclusion about the nature of life, then it throws everything that we think we know something about, consciousness, life and death, reality itself, totally up into the air. Especially the idea that whatever it is we identify as me doesn't really end when your body ends. That's big, right? And most of us are just not comfortable going there. So I think we have stopped short of being able to talk clearly about what this might mean. And I think the other thing is that it goes against a fixed reality that is really at the backbone of everything. I think we talked about this in the first podcast, but this idea of a positivist orientation, the idea that there's a fixed reality that we can converge on and we can measure it from a bunch of different places in a bunch of different ways, but we'll get the right thing, like gravity. It exists. It will always exist. There are fundamental principles. It's so deeply ingrained everywhere that it's the backbone of our scientific endeavors, all of our prominent religions for the most part, and or the most Western prominent religions anyway. And sort of just everyday life, it throws everything into question. So the last thing I just want to say before we move on to the evidence base, which is really where it gets really fun, is that while it can be mind-bending to entertain some of these ideas, they're so fascinating and they're intensely important. It's because they're not just conceptual. There are implications for how we live, how we perceive, how we understand what we're perceiving, how we interact with the world, how we interact with others, how we grieve, how we welcome life in, and how we react and experience when it leaves. Mostly, it's been utterly fascinating and delightful for me. It's kind of awe-inspiring. So it's a little bit like moving from an elementary school playground to an Olympic-sized field, only then to discover that there are cosmic-sized fields beyond that yet to explore. So I think that's all I want to add in prelude before we dive into the evidence, which I think really does kind of explain how we both arrived here.
Right. And before we go there, I just want to say a couple more things in my reflection on this. One is that in my conversation with Bernardo Kastrup, I asked him why he thought there was such resistance to this notion gaining steam, because we're going to get into later, actually, there's a lot of empirical data pointing in this direction. It's not for lack of evidence that this is not being adopted. It's because of these intuitions in our culture, and they kind of become these cultural overlays which we inherit, and it's in the water, so to speak, that we grow up in, right? And any of us alive today have grown up in an era where this has been the dominant paradigm. And I think also one thing that I would suggest to people to try to wrap their heads around how this could be true, how mind and mental processes could be responsible for everything, even when we bang our knee, that just is a certain modulation of consciousness, is to think about something like virtual reality. So this is a notion that's come on board over the last few years, and most people by now have put on an Oculus headset or something like that and have experienced what it's like to have a 3D rotating world moving around you as you turn and things, and it feels immersively real, completely real. And so you take off the headset and realize, wait a second, that was engaging limbs of my body. I was feeling it. I was even getting dizzy sometimes if I was going too fast. Your brain is fooled by it. So what this helps us realize is that just because it feels real doesn't mean that what we're actually experiencing is the nature of reality itself in its most fundamental nature. And the last piece I want to bring in that has been central for me to understand this is that when we think about really immersive dreams, I can lucid dream, right? So as I've said to Janice, I sometimes use this substance called galantamine, which helps you more likely have lucid dreams. It definitely increases the vividness of your dreams. So I have a certain protocol I use where I wake up at 3 a.m. kind of thing, just before I'm going to go into REM, meditate, set an intention, then go into REM and have these really mind-blowing dreams. Often I can become lucid in them. And then I've conducted my own research. I look around in the dream, I touch things, I scratch my skin, and everything feels as convincingly real and quote-unquote physical as the waking world. And once you've had that experience and you've asked the question, you wake up and go, so what empirical evidence is available to me to believe that this is any less a dreamscape than what I just came out of? And you realize there isn't. But again, it takes a while to get there because this is such a ubiquitous aspect of the culture we grew up in.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, while you were talking, it made me think about Roger Ebert. You remember Siskel and Ebert? And you probably caught this too after he died. There were some reports around some of the stuff that he said prior to his death. This is the little segment I found. But the day before he passed away, he wrote me a note. The note said, "This is all an elaborate hoax." I asked him, "What's a hoax?" And he was talking about this world, this place. He said it was all an illusion. I thought he was just confused, but he wasn't confused. He was visiting heaven, not the way we think of heaven. He described it as a vastness that you can't even imagine. It was a place where the past, present, and future were all happening at once. I remember when I encountered that the first time, I loved it because it's so consonant with everything that you find, right? So we look at the scriptures, meaning the old mystical texts, from every tradition for the most part, indigenous wisdom, and the stories of how they came to be and what the nature of reality is. If we look at all of the different kinds of scientific bases we're going to be talking about today, if we look at the experiences of people who've experienced contact with unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAP, it just converges over and over and over in the same way. So let me just start really quickly with just a little bit about what history, lore, spiritual texts say, because you do see in all of the mystical traditions, you see some very similar, as I just said, concept being identified as being important and foundational. So, for example, Advaita Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism in Hinduism And in Buddhism, you've got Zen and Dzogchen, and you've got Sufism in Islam, and Kabbalah in Judaism, and then you've got Christian mysticism. All of those, and there are more. I was just looking at a handful of the big ones. They all differ in their specific practices and cultural context, but they have these features that are always the same. So this idea of unity or oneness. They almost always emphasize the foundational unity or oneness of all existence. They suggest that the apparent separateness of things is, as Ebert was saying, an illusion, and that everything is interconnected and part of a single universal consciousness or divine reality. There's also this idea of the transcendence of duality. So most of the mystical traditions aim to, part of what the practices are, is to transcend the idea that there is a separation between the material and the non-material, that there's a separation between anything, that all things are fundamentally interconnected and even more reflective of each other. So you and I speak a lot, I know, in our conversations about the idea of fractals, that there's a geometry to the nature of reality that seems to show up in a fractalized way, these reflections of each other. It makes for wonderful synchronicities, like I know you just talked about in liminal frames. They also talk about the idea of a divine or ultimate reality. Many of the mystical traditions posit that there is an ultimate reality, a divine reality. You can call it source, you can call it God, you can call it anything you want. It's one unique intelligence that permeates everything. It pervades all existence, whether it feels sentient like us or not. So it can be the absolute, Brahman, the ground of being. There's a bunch of different terms. And then I think we kind of alluded to this earlier, but I just want to emphasize it. This illusion of separateness. This is a piece that comes up over and over in all the traditions, the mystical traditions. The idea that what we think is not us, is out there, is separate from us, is not at all. It's all you, which is one of the reasons why things like war just ends up looking ridiculous. Like, who are you killing? You're killing yourself. And I, we'll get to this at some point, maybe not today, but I know one of the messages that you and I have talked about a lot from the UAP and the non-human intelligence that communicate around that is this sense that humans don't understand. They're not separate, right? They're not separate from. They're part of a much larger fabric, and they're certainly not separate from each other. And so they need to start respecting that and not killing each other. And then I think the other thing is that that comes up over and over in these mystical traditions, and I know is a part of this experience, and part of what makes it hard to touch is that it just feels ineffable. They're often, the experiences of the divine are often described as sort of beyond the ordinary language and conceptual thought. It's why we often get poetry or paradox or symbolism that points to the nature of reality. It can't be easily conceptualized, quantified, and discrete because it's literally everything. And, I suspect, you and I have talked about this too, that as we get further along in our understanding culturally, that we will start to come up with language or concepts that can capture that a little better than we can now. I think we're pretty early in that process in a lot of ways. And I know, having come from academia, that a lot of the physicists I know are super reluctant to apply this to consciousness or reality. I mean, there's just a lot of no-go zones there. So we haven't developed the language for talking about it. The last thing I want to end before I bounce it to you here is a wonderful example from Jalil ad-Din Rumi. He's many of you know, a Sufi. He says about the nature of reality, not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi, or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the east or the west, not out of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist. I am not an entity in this world or the next, did not descend from Adam and Eve or any origin story. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless, neither body or soul. I belong to the beloved, have seen the two worlds as one, and that one call to and know, first, last, outer, inner, only that breath breathing human being.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And I think also of, you are not a drop in the ocean, you are the ocean in a drop, which I love as well. And I just want to highlight what we've said so far just to really make clear how convincing this case actually is, because first of all, we have all of these ancient traditions around the world independently coming to a very similar conception about what ultimate reality is consisted of. And that in itself is remarkable because we want to remember that this is from a period in Earth history where there was not a lot of cross-pollination amongst these different cultures. And so these groups were independently, because of their own practices, their own exploration of the nature of reality, even though it was pre-scientific, they still had various techniques they used, usually often interior techniques, going within themselves to find what they found there. And what's remarkable is that they came to some very similar conceptions. Sometimes there might be slight differences in the language they use, but when you really parse that out and look at a deeper level, it's describing something very similar. Now, it's interesting because even within monotheistic traditions like Christianity, some people might say, well, that's a bit different than the Eastern traditions. Christianity, in terms of a monotheistic religion, is not really into non-duality. And there is some truth to that. But first thing I'd want to point out is there's a real broad spectrum of belief within Christianity. And when you look at specifically mystical Christianity, which is what you pointed to there, Janice, then you really begin to see it. And I really want to highlight that mystical Christianity is about people who have really done a deep dive into their own personal practice into interiority. And when you do that, when you're Thomas Merton, this is what they find. And one of my transitions to becoming a practicing Zen Buddhist was that actually Thomas Merton helped take me there. So I was coming out of Christianity and then into mystical Christianity. And then in his own exploration in prayer and deep contemplative prayer, Thomas Merton ended up realizing he was experiencing aspects of reality that weren't that different than Zen Buddhism. And he actually began to communicate with these different Zen Buddhists, and they actually had this really rich dialogue back and forth. He wrote a book called Zen and the Birds of Appetite that really helped turn me on to that. So that's the first thing to point out, is that even these different groups around the world are coming to a very similar conception about the nature of reality. And to your point about the fact that we can all touch this because we are this, this is evidenced in that very practice, right? That when you begin to do this work, when you look deeply into the nature of reality, by looking within yourself, which is a holographic fractal of the whole, you find this. And we see this evidenced in history. And then even for those people who might want to say, well, that's all hogwash, that's all spiritual stuff, I don't believe any of that, show me some hard science. Even science is pointing in this direction. This is the quantum revolution, that the revelations that came out of those experiments point in exactly the same direction. And that's why we're in such a remarkable time. And just to bring it back to our main thesis here on this podcast, that while we're going through some crazy times, we are also on the verge of revolution and understanding the nature of reality and the way we can play a role as agents of consciousness in even shaping that reality.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. I totally agree. And I think it's part of what makes this time so exciting. And I know, like you, having watched all these different streams kind of feeding to this river for now several decades, it's really exciting. You made me think of the Dalai Lama. He wrote a wonderful book called The Universe in a Single Atom, in which he described how he came to create or suggest creation of the Mind and Life conferences. And as a part of that, the Mind and Life Summer Research Institutes that happen every year. At least they were for many years. I'm not sure. I think they're still happening. But I loved it. I went in 2010 at the Garrison Institute in New York, and I loved it because it was a place where there was a structured place where Eastern-trained lamas, the Dalai Lama's lamas, came together with Western-trained researchers with the idea that data isn't just outside you, it's inside you, your data too. So how do we, and our subjective experience is inextricably connected to the external world. So how do we merge these data sources, basically, in the Western parlance, to the best effect? I mean, it wasn't an easy question to answer. Obviously, especially because Western trained researchers are so programmed to think of themselves as completely separate from the data, but easy to see how you might get around that. But I think it does lead into some pretty interesting questions and actually paves the way to the next segment of our conversation, which is, what does quantum science tell us about the nature of reality? Because we do have a now pretty solid scientific base around this, yeah?
We do indeed, and that's what I was referring to. And again, what's fascinating about the times we live in is that even though we've had the revelations of the quantum mechanical experiments for 100 years, it really has not been grokked and metabolized amongst the scientific mainstream. And that's partly why these different theories have sprung into existence in terms of trying to interpret what this means, because to really highlight this, because the revelations were so counterintuitive, so shocking, there have been various interpretations to sort of try to backpedal in some ways. Is there some way we can save this? Are we somehow measuring inaccurately? What is going on here? Surely this can't be the nature of reality, because again, it's ironically pointing back towards the same kind of picture of reality that some of these ancient traditions had. And to that point, what I'd like to do is draw the parallels between specifically quantum physics and Vedanta. Now, both Janice and I have been really influenced by Vedanta, and specifically Advaita Vedanta, and that way of seeing the world has been most resonant for us. And again, it's fascinating how many parallels there are with quantum mechanics. So let me walk through some of those. The first one is the unity of all things. So in quantum physics, one of the fundamental ideas is that everything in the universe is interconnected. The phenomenon of entanglement, which we discussed last time a little bit, shows that particles can become linked such that the state of one instantaneously influences the state of another regardless of distance. Now, in Vedanta philosophy, there's an emphasis on the concept of Brahman, which Janice mentioned earlier. This is the ultimate unchanging reality, which is the source of everything. It posits that all forms in the universe are expressions of this singular reality. In other words, an entangled oneness. Next, we have the observer effect, evidenced in both quantum physics and in Vedanta. So the observer effect in quantum mechanics suggests that the act of observation affects the system being observed. That sounds so counterintuitive and so revolutionary, but this is what the empirical data is pointing towards. This is famously illustrated by the double slit experiment, which I know Janice mentioned in our last podcast episode, where particles behave differently when observed. Shocking. And in Vedantic thought, consciousness is central. The Upanishads state that the world we perceive is influenced by our consciousness, suggesting a participatory role of the observer in the creation of reality. Again, a total parallel there. Next, we have the illusion of a separate reality, which Janice already touched on a little bit. In quantum mechanics, it challenges the notion of a solid objective reality. We already discussed this. Particles exist in a state of probability until observed. They are not fixed things, suggesting that what we perceive as reality is not fixed. And in Vedanta, the concept of Maya is referring to the illusion of the appearance of the world. It suggests that the material world is not the ultimate reality, but a manifestation of a deeper spiritual truth. Next, we have non-locality. Non-locality refers to the idea in quantum physics that objects are not confined to a specific location in space and time. This is evident in the entanglement phenomenon. And in Vedanta, there's a teaching that Brahman, the ultimate reality, is beyond space and time, omnipresent and not limited by physical dimensions. Then we have the wave-particle duality. In quantum physics, this points to how particles exhibit both wave-like and particle-like properties depending on how they are measured. This duality is a cornerstone of quantum mechanics. And in Vedantic philosophy, there's also speaking of this, where dual aspects of reality, the transient, impermanent, and the eternal or permanent. It acknowledges the dual nature of existence and consciousness. One last one to get to, reality as a field of possibilities. Quantum physics describes reality as a field of probabilities and potentials. Key on a potential there, people. We really need to key in on potential in the time we're in, where particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until measured. And Vedanta speaks of the infinite potential of Brahman, where all possibilities exist. The material world is seen as a manifestation of this potentiality. So that's remarkable when you consider some of those parallels. And again, this is not a stretch to try to make things fit together, to force a round peg into a square hole. This is a true parallel. We are seeing the revelations come out of our most cutting-edge science, pointing in exactly the same directions that these revelations occurred to these deep seekers of ultimate wisdom 4,000 or 5,000 years ago.
Yeah, oh, very well said. I love that. And isn't it fun? I mean, this is where, I don't think many people spend so much time kind of looking at all the different angles, but truly, once you do, the parallels are striking. They're not just sort of parallels. They're not just in the ballpark parallels. They're very precise parallels. And it just continues going.
I think it speaks for itself. That list is just really impressive. And I just really want people to maybe, if they need to, rewind that part and listen to it again, because these are one-to-one parallels. we are having evidence presented to us by, I would say, a deeper structure of reality that is putting us in a position to completely and fundamentally change how we handle reality, how we even, again, shape reality. So this is the opportunity before us, evidenced in both.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other empirical findings that have come out of different kinds of research, and I'm going to start with a story. Darrell Bem was a really famous psychologist. He was, one of the premier methodologists for the American Psychological Association. He was in an administrative role in that capacity. He was well known for his capacity to design really good studies. He retired, and he then published a paper in 2011 called Feeling the Future, Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect. This was 9 experiments that tested whether future events could unconsciously influence people's thoughts and behaviors in the present. He waited till he retired to publish this study. I think that says something about this current context. The studies really focused more on precognition rather than physiological presentiment, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But he was really interested in whether people are able to use information from the future to influence the present. He, as I said, was a premier methodologist. I remember vividly because I was watching with hawk eyes what happened with this. I had heard about it. He sent it to the premier journal. I can't remember exactly which one it was, but it was a top-tier methodology journal. They sent it out to, I think, 11 reviewers, which is kind of unheard of. Typically, it goes out 2, maybe 3. The goal was to get this paper rejected. Nobody wanted to publish it, but they couldn't because it was so well designed. And it did come out, but note, it came out in like early January of, I think it was 2011, when everybody was on vacation and it would all be buried. It made people very nervous. So basically what he found was that, like for example, in one experiment, participants were more likely to correctly guess which curtain an erotic image would appear behind, as if they were unconsciously influenced by the future location of the image. In another study, participants were faster at categorizing words that they would later be asked to practice, suggesting that the future practice session retroactively influenced their initial categorization speed. In another experiment, similar to the presentiment research, which I'll talk about in a second, participants showed physiological arousal as measured by skin conductance before reviewing erotic images, but not before viewing neutral images, as if their bodies were anticipating the future event. That comes up over and over. So basically, he reported statistically significant effects in 8 out of the 9 experiments, with effect sizes ranging from small to medium. You can find this, but it's not a hard study to find, and I'm pretty sure it was conducted in collaboration with the Noetic Institute for Science, IONS, so the paper is there and elsewhere. But I was most interested in how he was going to explain his findings. And my bet was that it was going to be quantum physics, right? Because how else are you going to explain things like this? And that's exactly what happened. If you look at the discussion section, it's just riddled with quantum physics. Time-symmetric quantum observables was one. Retrocausality is another of the concepts he borrows from. And quantum entanglement is another one of the ways he explains it. So his work goes, is really hand in hand with a lot of the other research that has been done on presentiment, this idea that you can anticipate a future event. And we see this regularly. I mean, there have been fMRI studies, which are basically, looking at people's brain responses. You can look at brain responses and you can look at the sequencing prior to an image being shown, and you can see the physiological response in the brain and in the body through heart rate variability and skin conductance starts before an image is shown. And that has been a pretty consistent finding in that area. And in fact, I was looking at, how many studies have been conducted in presentiment. And we have, just since in the last couple decades, there are 92 results from the Web of Science. And a really nice meta-analysis of 26 studies in this area occurred in 2012, and they found really persistently that there was an overall effect size across all of these studies that were typically small to medium. And again, it was always, for the most part, the authors and researchers leaned on quantum physics to explain it.
Yeah, I love that particular part, and I've talked about this on my other podcasts as well. And I think here of the work of Dean Radin, who's been probably the chief proponent of this kind of work and has really helped move this so far forward. And to your point about how rigorous those protocols were, in that same way, Dean Radin knows that he's going to be under critical analysis and skepticism. He's going to run into left, right, and center everywhere he looks within the sciences. And so he designs his experiments to be incredibly rigorous, really have to reach a higher degree of rigor than any other experiment you would do in any other kind of field, because what he's trying to demonstrate is so counterintuitive to the prevailing paradigm. But exactly the same thing. And to your point about meta-analyses of multiple studies, that's even more compelling when you see that data, because it's saying even when you do a statistical analysis of multiple studies, you get as strong an effect, which makes you confident that it's not just a skewing of a bad experiment that was poorly done or something. And just to really highlight what happens here, again, Radin and his colleagues have been so careful to conduct these experiments so that any kind of way that people could explain it away is accounted for. So, for instance, some people say, well, maybe these experimenters are somehow shuffling the images in such a way that it's going to influence people. So what they do is they have the computer randomly choose the image. So even the experimenters are blind to the target. They don't know what it's going to be next. And as Janice said, it shows up in people's bodies. So if they're going to show them a bunch of bland images, and then they show them sort of more shocking images, either arousing images or violent images. And as Janice said, it shows up in our bodies before we see the image. Another one is pupil dilation. You mentioned a couple. That's another one that is really, really key. And this is telling us empirically in the data that somehow we know what's going to happen before it happens. I also want to bring up a couple more quickly. I was listening to a presentation that Anthony Peake gave recently, and he also spoke about this. And he talked about interesting dynamics where we have a certain way of perceiving the world, and we assume we're just perceiving in a straight one-to-one way what's really out there. But for instance, there'll be times where someone in the distance slams a car door, and we perceive it as happening in parallel with seeing and hearing, car door slam and seeing it close. But actually, we know the speed of sound takes some time to travel. And so actually, those are not happening simultaneously. But our brain somehow presents to us an experience of simultaneity. And what he's arguing is that actually our brain is relying on our future knowledge and then presenting to us after the fact a constructed narrative reality that is easier to navigate by, which is fascinating.
Awesome. All right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the placebo effect, because I remember when I first encountered this, and the placebo effect, for those of you, I think most people kind of at least heard about this. The placebo effect is, you're told you're given a pill that's going to have a certain effect, but it's actually a sugar pill. And instead, you generate the effect only through your mind, basically. So there's no actual substance introduced to the body, but the effect is still noted. This started showing up in early medical studies and a variety of other studies for treatment effects. And I remember first encountering it, I don't even know, like probably 30 years ago. And it was written off, right? And most of the literature is like, well, it's just a placebo effect. And I'm just like, wait. The fact that anything like that ever happened, that's important. Why are we not studying how that happens? How is it that the brain thinks that it's getting a drug to treat cancer? It's not really getting a drug to treat cancer, but the cancer goes into remission. That's huge. I was as much amazed at people's shrug as I was at the actual effect. So I think it has in more recent years become a focus of its own study, and it should. And, and the findings are everything you would expect because it's very synonymous to this. But I think one of the examples of the placebo effect that I used to talk about in one of the classes that I taught on translational research was phantom limb pain. It's so interesting, right? So some of you may be aware that some people who lose an arm or a leg or some sort of limb still have a sense that it's there. And not only do they still have a sense that it's there, but some people can literally have excruciating pain in it. I think one study showed that if a limb was lost while it was tense, there was a grip, the muscles were being strongly activated, that it leaves this sense of deep pain in the psyche, even though the limb is no longer there. And some people have actually ended their lives because this pain is so chronic and so bad. So there was a series of studies. Gosh, I wish I could give credit to the scholar who did this. I'm going to say his name wrong, so I'm not going to say it. But it was a really fascinating set of studies that led him to try this really wonderful intervention, which is if he puts a mirror where the other limb is, like, so that it looks like the limb is not lost, and your mind, your eyes are seeing the restored limb because it's reflecting the other limb in a mirror. And people worked with it. It's called mirror box therapy. It eliminated the pain because what they would tell them to do is, well, squeeze the limb that you have and then release it. Let your mind see that it's being released. And that release mechanism, the mind calculating or seeing that it was released, allowed them to, and having it look like the phantom limb that was lost, allowed the limb to relax. That's huge, right? I know it's one of the things that has been going around the internet recently, maybe some of you have seen it, is the rubber hand illusion, where somebody has a rubber hand, right? It's not, their hand is not there. It just looks like their hand, and somebody is doing various things to it, poking it, pricking it, moving it, touching it, and they're reacting. Their brain is observing it, they're reacting. Somebody then hits it with a hammer, and they flinch as though they were seriously damaged. So those kinds of experiments, along with the other placebo effects, which I find fascinating. If you give somebody a bigger pill than a smaller pill, they'll have a bigger effect. If you put somebody who gives them the pill in a white jacket and make them look like a medical professional as opposed to their friend, it will have a bigger effect. If they have a stethoscope as opposed to no stethoscope, then the reaction is bigger. All these different things that signal to the mind, this is serious. It's being given to me by a reputable healing person, a medical person. It's big, it's important. They'll have the corresponding effect. It's fascinating. And that alone just suggests that our minds have an extraordinary amount of power over what we think of is fully outside of us or completely independent of our mind, that our beliefs and our expectations matter a lot. And I think this is super important because when you start to really work with these principles, the quantum principles of reality, it becomes really important how important the mind is. If you want to be able to surf it in a way that's, and I know we'll talk about this later and more, if you want to be able to surf it in a way that allows you to kind of make the best use of the idea that we're living in a quantum reality, basically, you really need to understand how to work with mind and meaning. And basically, if we can assign meaning, and meaning collectively assigned to meaning will have a pretty big impact on what we experience. All right, I'm going to stop there because there's tons more examples, and I know you have some examples and probably some things to add, so go for it.
Well, first I want to touch on what you brought up there because those are fascinating. I really want to highlight for people what's really going on here, what this is revealing about the nature of reality, because again, so much of what is assumed is just that. It's an assumption. It's not empirically supported. So the placebo effect speaks for itself. People believe that it's going to help them, and it does, even though there's no objective medicinal value. These are literally sugar pills. Now, the one with how they were able to help the phantom limb pain by giving the mind a visual of something that can connect to, so it can rewire, like you say, release that grip and then finally feel that release. What's fascinating about that is that, again, we assume that these signals are being sent neurochemically from our brain to the limbs of our body. But again, that's an assumption. And what this demonstrates is that can't be the case because there is no limb to send the neurochemical message to, and yet it's still responding. And just with mental intention, by making this association mentally, you're able to relieve muscle pain for a muscle that doesn't exist. This is really fascinating when you think about the implications here. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about Anthony Peake, that actually what's actually going on and how we navigate the world is different than what we've been taught. And what many people are basically saying here, and I know we're going to get into psi a little bit and what that also points to, but basically we are actually walking through the world with telekinetic capacities. And we are just assuming that it's happening on a physical level, but it's not. And actually, when you really get precise about the measurements, you realize there isn't even enough time for these signals to be sent for them to respond like they are. And sometimes, like we pointed out earlier, with these images that are shown, sometimes we respond before we even have the stimulus. So again, I really want people to stop and just really think about what is that saying about the nature of reality and how much more power, agency do we have over our reality once we realize that. It's really fascinating. Now, I know there's some other ones we want to get into that also point to the nature of reality, and this is based on human experience. One that I'll point to right away is OBEs, which stands for out-of-body experiences. So this is basically where people have an experience of leaving their body. In other words, their bodies are still lying in their bed or something like that, and yet they're able to go to different places and have these different experiences. Now, for skeptics who might say, well, yeah, they're just dreaming. What's so great about that? But what's been fascinating is in these studies, again, we're able to find empirical evidence saying that they are actually moving through the world and obtaining evidence that we're able to corroborate that they did indeed pick up legitimate evidence, meaning they were moving through the world. And a great example is this one person was in a hospital and they had an out-of-body experience. And they drifted up out of their bed, left the hospital, went floating over top the hospital, and looked down and they saw a shoe sitting on top of this window ledge. And it's the kind of thing you could only see from above the hospital. You could not see it from below. You could not see it from one of the hospital rooms from within the hospital. And later on, people went and confirmed that was the case. So this person came back, came out of the out-of-body experience, came back into their body, and when they were revived, and this is related to NDEs because often OBEs are part of NDEs, they mentioned how they went on this great journey, and then they said, yeah, I saw a shoe. It's up on top of the window up there on the 4th floor or whatever. And then they went and were able to verify this. So we have objective evidence saying people really are leaving their body, still having conscious experiences, still having sensory experiences, right? They're seeing things, they're smelling things, they're feeling things. Of course, what we want to ask as physicalists is, how can they have sensory experiences when they have no senses present to experience that data, experience those phenomena? So this is, again, pointing to the fact that somehow, going back to what we said earlier, the whole thing's a hoax. It's an illusion, that actually somehow these are all mental processes, and we, again, live under the illusion of a physical world where we're navigating a physical world, but ultimately, these all being modulations of consciousness. And once you really begin to think about that, it really does change fundamentally not only what this is, but maybe why we're here as well.
Right. Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, I really would love to. I mean, we just do need to spend some time exploring what you just said, what this is and why we're here. But we won't do that today because we already have lots on our plate. But I really do want to bookmark that for another time. I mean, I think one of the things that keeps coming up for me as I'm listening to you speak and I'm thinking about where we're going is just the incredible social and professional resistance to a lot of the implications. I think a lot of people assume, well, if this was true and it's so amazing, why don't we know? Why isn't it in textbooks? Why isn't it taught at colleges? Why are we not talking about it? And that's a really important question and something I've watched alongside the evolution of our science and our understanding about this because it's amazing. So NDEs, which are near-death experiences, are a very close cousin to the out-of-body experiences you just talked about. And it's one area where, I mean, there have been reports of near-death experiences forever. And typically they just get shunned or dismissed, right? And it's only been in the last maybe decade and a half that serious people, serious researchers, serious physicians, because they're the ones often hearing about it as somebody comes out of anesthesia, have started to take it seriously, not dismiss it. So I think that's really important. That signals to me that we are getting ready to be able to embrace kind of the full implications of what all this means. But let's talk a little bit about NDEs for just a minute because they really are important. A near-death experience is much more like what you just described, Darren, where the soul leaves the body, something leaves the body, consciousness leaves the body and has a vantage point. It has a perspective from a different place. So it can be up on the ceiling and it can, and the standard and NDE reports are being able to overhear what the doctors and the nurses are saying. Things that somebody under anesthesia or clinically dead, flatlined, shouldn't be able to do, right? But when they come back, they talk about what they heard, what they saw. The example you gave is wonderful. They can float down the hallway and see other patients in other rooms or overhear snippets of conversation or actually be somewhere else entirely at their house or someplace else, the park nearby. It is really, really common. And if you want to get a sense of this, go to the internet and type in near-death experience because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples. One of the effects that there's some really consistent themes. I think one of the things you typically see, though, as an aftermath of a near-death experience is radical transformation of a life, right? It often changes people irrevocably. They often leave jobs or I guess sometimes leave relationships because their partners can really know it and they can't relate to what happened to them. They feel fundamentally transformed. It's profound. And they often describe it not as traumatic, but as something that's really full of growth. They often report having far less fear of death. And they have a much clearer sense of purpose and mission and meaning in their life. They know why they're here. I think one of the things that's most interesting to me is how often people say they didn't want to come back. I think that's fascinating, especially as a mother and somebody invested in her life. I'm like, wow, really? I mean, but, people that can have many young children can still say they really don't want to come back. It is like the Ebert idea of they seem to describe that none of this is real in the way that we think it's real. It's not that they're being cold. They just know themselves and the fundamental consciousness or souls or energy bodies of the people they love aren't really being damaged down there on earth. It's just, well, as the Hindus would say, it's Leela. It's a play of consciousness. It's really hard to grasp that in our sort of material mind, I know. There have been a number of now studies of NDEs. I think there's one just came out not long ago. It was a very large study. I'm so glad people are taking it seriously. In 2008, there was a 2,060 patients study from 15 hospitals in the UK, in the US, and Australia. It was called the AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation. And they found that among the survivors, 39% reported having memories during their cardiac arrest, and 19% met the criteria for a near-death experience, meaning this is really common. One of the other things that can happen during an NDE is unusual healing, or it's not just transformation, but the body can be fundamentally altered. So, for example, there's a woman, I think Anita Mojari is, I believe, her name. She was diagnosed with cancer. She was actively dying of cancer. She was in the hospital. They said, call everybody. Her family was nearby. Her brother got on a plane from India to the States, and she was literally expected to die within a few days. She has this NDE and maybe more of an OBE, an out-of-body experience. She has this transformative experience. She understands so much more about why she's there. She wakes up and she says it's going to be okay. And her cancer is gone within a few weeks. And she goes on to live her life full of purpose, mostly to tell the rest of us that what you think is real is not real. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of this. And now it's starting to be in the literature. So it again speaks to all these things we've been talking about, the idea that there's a spiritual realm, that life review is really common. So they see the whole of their life and they understand the design of it, the reason for it, in ways they just couldn't have accessed while they were in a normal body. And I'll just leave everybody with this too. One of the most common features of near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences is this overwhelming sense of love and compassion. That is not cold. It is not cruel. Even people who understand and meet and touch the hardness of the life that they've had or other people's have had describe a breakthrough and an understanding and this being held with compassion, deep, deep compassion, unlike anything they've ever touched. I have to say personally, having now gone down, listened and learned and absorbed and touched all these different things, it leaves me feeling much more peaceful about life and death and everything that we're in. I think it's one of the reasons that I can hold some of the conversations you and I have, because some of them are kind of sobering.
They are, and I think that the information we've provided today so far, I think will really help people think about the challenges we're facing differently. How could it not change the way you think about these things, especially when you take into consideration things like the life review? That basically not only how we respond is important, did we respond with compassion, that kind of thing, but also even the events of our lives are to some degree scripted for us to be presented with the catalyst or the resistance training that gives us the opportunity to respond one way rather than another. So we should think about that not just in our own lives, but as a collective. The challenges we're facing, that is part of the catalyst that's been provided for us, and therefore how will we respond differently? Again, realizing that it's sort of real and sort of not real. And just to highlight what Jenna said there, people don't say of these near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences that they're kind of wispy and ephemeral. They say it's more real than real. It's more real than this is. This is what feels like the virtual reality when they come back into it. And that should certainly challenge the notions we've been taught. Now, speaking of that, I want to mention one more piece here. Now, Janice mentioned earlier UAP, which is unidentified anomalous phenomena, tied to NHI, which stands for non-human intelligence. Now, what's fascinating is that even in our encounters with these beings, many of them seem to operate under this understanding of reality, and they encourage us to return to this understanding. And this particular case touches not just on the nature of reality and our ultimate being, but also how we could heal ourselves if we really understand and put into action those kinds of principles. So this speaks of the Varginha incident. This was a famous case known as the Brazilian Roswell that occurred in January 1996 in Brazil. There was an initial sighting, there was military and police involvement, there were hospital reports, subsequent encounters, government denial, all the usual that you get with UFO cases. But very interestingly, several people encountered a being that seemed kind of trapped on Earth and seemed kind of scared. Now, what's interesting is there was later an interview with the physician who actually was looking over this being, and he actually had a conversation with this being. And James Fox put together a great movie about this, and he actually recounted this conversation. And this is what was said. So the person said, "Please go ahead and tell us what he told you." He's talking to the physician. "What did this being tell you?" And he said, "Essentially, he told me his race felt very sorry for human beings for basically two reasons. The first is that all humans have the same potential and abilities to perform the very same things his race could do. Those things we find so marvelous and magical, but humans did not know how to do them. For example, he told me in cases where there is injury or disease of the body, it would not be necessary to confine one of his species to a special treatment facility such as this one. He told me they either individually or jointly together could produce all the healing necessary to repair their bodies. The second reason they felt sorry for us was that we did not seem to realize we were spiritual beings only living in a temporary shell, and we were totally disconnected from our spiritual self," unquote. So we've talked about these ancient spiritual traditions pointing in this direction. We've talked about the empirical science. We've talked about human experience. And now we're talking about the experience and testimony of a non-human intelligence who's pointing in this exact same direction. Pretty compelling evidence, I would say. All right, with all that really compelling data in mind, I'll pass it off to you, Janice, for any final thoughts.
Thanks, Darren. I think, we'll pick this up again later, but I would love for people to listen to this maybe once or twice if you haven't touched these ideas before, and really focus on how amazing they are and what they mean for the reality of your life. It's not just a set of abstract ideas that you're going to read about in a textbook someday. It has massive implications for everything. And I would argue, having gone down this road a good bit, that it's all good. Like, there's nothing about this that's fundamentally scary or bad. It expands pretty much everything, and it makes what seems impossible possible and what seems magical science.
Absolutely. And that's going to bring us to a close of this edition of the podcast. We hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks' time for Event Horizon.